Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to the second day of USENIX Enigma 2021 and the only panel that we have this year. We have assembled four fantastic experts: Marcel Salate from EPFL, Ali Lang from Google, Tiffany Lee from Boston University, and Michael Judd from the CDC to talk about digital contact tracing. Now, the reason that we cannot all be here together in the same physical space is, of course, COVID-19. And since the beginning of the pandemic, you've probably heard the term contact tracing. What is contact tracing? Well, maybe you've seen the movie Contagion, where Kate Winslet does a lot of jobs. And one of the jobs is contact tracing. She runs around looking for people who have been infected and people who have been exposed to people who have been infected. And she does her best to isolate them to contain the spread. That is contact tracing. And she's running around because the faster she moves, the faster she isolates people, the better off we are in terms of containing the spread of the disease. 2020 is when COVID-19 emerged. And of course, like many other things in 2020, a lot of people started asking, can we apply technology? Can we maybe use our cell phones, which have GPS location, the ability to communicate with each other, the ability to talk to central servers? Can we use cell phones to facilitate contact tracing, to record, if you will, the people that we're close to, so that if somebody is unfortunately infected with COVID-19, then we can backtrace their contacts? And as soon as this idea was proposed, many questions came up. Should we even use technology? After all, we've been doing contact tracing for decades without it. Do we even need it now? Even if we implement it, since public health departments have to be involved, will they know how to deploy it? Will they even deploy it? Is it something that they'll want to do? Will users install whatever application they need to install on their phone? Will people game the system? What about this location data? Will it get misused? Will this even work? Are we just trying to solve a problem that we don't really need to solve in this way? To answer all these questions, I want to reintroduce our panel of experts: Marcel Salate, Ali Lang, Tiffany Lee, and Michael Judd. And I urge all of you to get in Slack, get in the channel, ask questions, and I will do my best to moderate them. And now, Marcel, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. My name is Marcel Salate. I'm a digital epidemiologist. I run the Digital Epidemiology Lab at EPFL. EPFL is one of the two Swiss Federal Institutes of Technology and based in Geneva, Switzerland. So I want to briefly talk about the development of the DP3T protocol and the launch of the Swiss COVID app, which is Switzerland's proximity tracing app based on the exposure notification framework. And I entitled this talk "An Ode to Pragmatism Across Disciplines." And I hope at the end you understand why that is. So I've been interested in contacts, contact networks, infectious disease spread over contacts for a long time. 10 years ago, this was one of the first studies that we did on actually measuring also these contact networks. We used wireless sensor network technology. At the time, we couldn't quite leverage super widespread smartphone use at the time. But it sort of indicates, right, sort of an ongoing approach with technology to really figure out the details of these networks, understanding their importance in infectious disease spread. I always point to the Sociopatterns website by some colleagues in Italy and France and other countries, where you can find dozens of such deployments as examples. Now, in the wake of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, it became clear that these contacts are incredibly important. That's, after all, the sort of pathways along which the disease can spread. And it was important for us to be able to help manual contact tracing with technology, because we understood early on the importance of contact tracing, of testing, contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine. The challenge, of course, with this particular bug is that people can be infectious before they're symptomatic. And so if you focus only on isolating symptomatic people here, denoted in the dark red, then that's of course fine, because those people cannot at that stage infect further, but they have already infected others. And so if you only ever focus on symptomatic people, you're always running one step behind. And that's why it's important to have very rapid contact tracing, so that you can then also quarantine people who have been exposed. So the rapidity is of enormous interest, and if technology can help with one thing, I think it's with speed. And that's a better model than the alternative model, which is non-targeted quarantine, aka lockdowns, where everybody has to stay at home because everybody's sort of under general suspicion of having been exposed to this virus in one way or another. I think it's intuitively clear that this would be the better approach. So early on in the winter still of 2020, we formed a group that we called PEP-PT. This was with a couple of European colleagues. So we named it Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing, to make clear that we want this to work across borders and that it should have a very decent privacy preservation built in. But very rapidly, due to disagreements on transparency vis-a-vis the public and on this notion of centralized versus decentralized ways to go about doing this, a couple of us split off a group called DP3T, which stands for Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. And we were interested to be completely transparent, on GitHub and so on from day one. The decentralized approach eventually, as everyone knows, made it into the exposure notification framework by Apple and Google. And we managed to launch the Swiss COVID app shortly thereafter. It was the first national government app that was based on exposure notification to launch. And we also had a legal basis approved by Parliament, which I think was very nice. Now, my learnings from that time is that digital proximity tracing is a classical case of a challenge that the future will hand us multiple times, namely that you need both expertise in the technology, but also the relevant domain, which in this case was epidemiology. I've seen a lot of other groups who worked on the same problem, where I often felt they were lacking deep expertise in one of these areas, and that sometimes was a roadblock. And at EPFL, we were lucky because we had been building the transdisciplinary DNA of the project already way before COVID. And I usually describe this with bridges, right? You have to build bridges between the disciplines, but you can't build those bridges during the crisis, certainly not during a rapidly unfolding crisis like the COVID pandemic. You need to build them before, so that when the crisis hits, you can just walk over that bridge. This turns out to be a harder problem than most appreciate. As a digital epidemiologist, I mean, it's in my job title, the transdisciplinary nature of the work. And so it's something I've thought quite a bit about for many years. And I've observed that there's broad agreement that this transdisciplinary nature is of critical importance, and in some sense, even the future of science. But the academic system has a very hard time setting up the right structure, and certainly also setting up the right incentive structure for that to happen easily. There are still very few journals who, that are really sort of focusing on this type of work. There's still very few grants. There are still few academic prizes. All of these things that are important in the academic, infrastructure, that make it then very hard, right, for people to really have the right incentives to embark on that kind of work. And I think part of the core problem actually is that it is truly difficult, because you do need expertise in multiple areas, and all of us who work in one area know how hard it is to keep up in our own area, let alone then in multiple ones. And so the work also only gets reviewed by people who have expertise only in one area, and that makes the whole thing even more complicated. Now, to finish, something that I've also noticed, and that's even perhaps the bigger problem, is not only to then build the bridges so that you can make this work happen, but how it's then accepted also by the academic community and by others. Um, for example, when it comes to digital proximity tracing, there was this strong sense that there's a very strong negative trade-off between the preservation of privacy or the epidemiological impact, right? Where the notion was, well, either you build an app with which you can really tackle this pandemic, but then you have to throw privacy out the window, or you make it so privacy preserving that it has no epidemiological impact. And I think part of that is based on this myth that you always need more data to solve the problem, which I think is a widespread myth in epidemiology. Certainly more data can help, but first you should also ask yourself, how much can you solve the problem without even collecting the data? And so I think if you have this line in mind and you think that's just what it is, then I think you're not thinking in a way that would be possible, which I think is this, where you really try to leverage technology to the maximum extent possible to bend this curve, this trade-off curve. Because if you manage to bend it in such a way, and I think we did, then you can actually find points on this trade-off curve that represent a good pragmatic compromise, right, between these two views of looking at the world. And I think that's what DP3T was. I think that's what the exposure notification framework ended up being. It was sort of a solid, real world compromise between acceptable privacy risks and strong potential epidemiological impact, which I think is great. But we then noticed that we were actually, or these ideas were attacked quite heavily from people just looking through one lens at the problem. So you could, of course, then argue, well, this point of the curve I'm not happy with because this is not the best solution from a privacy perspective, or it is not the best solution from an epidemiological perspective. But that ignores, of course, the reality that there is a trade-off at the end of the day. And so that was difficult, and I think it reflected that lack of a transdisciplinary culture across academia, and that we really need to tackle. So if anything, this talk is really a plea for all of us to be more serious about transdisciplinary work, for academia also and industry to get its incentive structure right. Because if we do that, then first of all, we can walk over bridges when we need them instead of having to spend time to build them. And then when we find solutions, that there's a clear understanding that these are pragmatic solutions that are also necessary in the short term. And we don't lose time in these types of fights of not being absolutely perfect in one or another dimension. So that's it from my side. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Allie Lang. I work on the public policy team at Google, and I'm going to talk today about the Google Apple Exposure Notification System. I'm not going to explain too much about how the technology works. I think there's a pretty good sense at this point, but there is a lot of really good explanatory material online on our website and otherwise if people need more information. Instead, I wanted to spend some time sort of giving a behind the scenes look at what it was like to answer the question, how can a mobile phone help to fight a global pandemic? Of course, I am only one person, and I'm going to talk about this from my point of view as someone who worked on a couple of relevant projects, but literally hundreds of people worked on the things that I'm going to talk about. And please know that this is not the whole story, it's just my story. The other pieces, I'll pretty much be talking through the timeline from a US point of view, but understand that things were different in other places. So that's not meant to be rude. Speaking of which, I'm going to start the story on March 9th. March 9th was the first day I did not go into the Google office. I should note that many of our global colleagues were already working from home at that point. And my strongest memory of these first days of being home is this graphic. Do you remember this graphic? I wanted to remind us all what those first few weeks of being home were like, and the flatten the curve graphic was everywhere you went. Also, during this time period, there were a lot of questions around the role technology could or should play in the response to the pandemic. One of the most prominent ones, as far as the privacy debate, was about location data. So within a few weeks, there was a big question in the United States of whether the tech industry should be helping contribute mobile data or help to give information from location for mobile data to help respond to the pandemic. This had already been a big topic of conversation in other countries around the world. You see a couple of examples here on the bottom, and governments had made different decisions about what kinds of data could help, how to apply it, how to get it. But this was sort of the hot ticket privacy debate in those early days, at least from my point of view. So within this time period, Google actually put out a statement about how we were thinking about whether location data could be useful. By the time the Washington Post article was published on March 17th, we had already been doing a lot of work exploring this question. We were already in the process of kind of figuring out how to use our data. And we hadn't talked about it with the government, like the Post said, but we released this statement to help clarify. And as you'll see in our quote, our instinct was to look at aggregate patterns of movement from the data that we had. So on April 3rd, we had published the community mobility reports. These are actually still available today. They're really, really interesting. I highly recommend checking them out. They present aggregate information on how patterns of movement have changed. So are more people going to the grocery stores than we would typically expect? The information is useful for public health authorities to help them understand how social distancing was impacting patterns of movement. The reports provide the same type of aggregate anonymous insights that we use in Google Maps, for example, to power popular times or busyness features. And the data is only collected from users who've opted into a specific location feature. And then on top of that, these reports have extensive privacy protections, including some pretty good differential privacy. And there's actually a lot of really good documentation about all of that I recommend you check out if you're curious. But I just wanted to set this context. During the same period of time that we were working on the reports, researchers and governments around the world were really expanding their notion of how phones could be applied to support contact tracing. And the idea of using location data was starting to fall out of favor. So instead, people started to talk about Bluetooth Low Energy and how this technology could help. And within a few weeks from that late March, early April period, a number of researchers and experts released reports, code, even working apps that use Bluetooth Low Energy to help detect proximity for purposes of contact tracing. But these early implementations were facing a lot of challenges as they were deploying the novel technology, and it became clear that the mobile operating systems needed to make some technical changes to fully support the effort. So for example, interoperability between the platforms, between Android and iPhone was not very reliable. There were some battery issues, and there were some issues like you'll see reflected on the screen around having to keep the app in the foreground. So there were calls for Google and Apple to help with this and with other things at that time. And so on April 10th, we announced a partnership between Google and Apple. It was announced to help address these issues. So by collaborating together, we could provide a more reliable functionality to this technology, address some fragmentation that was appearing in the market, and create a common and really high baseline privacy and security standard. So this collaboration was intended to make the phones work the way those researchers and people who were developing these Bluetooth Low Energy apps intended, and hopefully support a great tool to stop the spread. So it's worth noting that this April 10th announcement was not a launch. It was just the news of a partnership, and the amount of work that was still ahead at that point was very daunting. And announcing the project before we'd finished building the tech put a lot of pressure on both companies. This project condensed what would have been months of work into a few weeks. People were working really, really long days through weekends, and often in addition to their day jobs to help contribute to the effort. It was a tense and a really exciting time for people who like to solve challenging problems, but it was definitely a really intense time period. Also, to help navigate this time period, because of how we had structured the rollout, there was this time between we announced the partnership and when we were actually going to launch the technology. And this was one of the more challenging phases to navigate. So during this time, you may recall we actually renamed the type of thing we were trying to do from contact tracing to exposure notification. We felt that was really a more accurate reflection of what we were doing, a more accurate understanding of the role the technology was going to play, which was to enhance contact tracing and not replace it. We also published the terms of service that developers had to agree to use the API. This included several restrictions that ensured really high standards for privacy. And during this period, there was a public debate in Europe about the best way to design the technology. It was really interesting. And so then we got to May, where we finally launched the technology. The thing that stands out to me most from this period of time was how we were thinking about privacy in the project. We really considered privacy protections to be essential to the success of the project. We believed that people would not use the system or wouldn't use it faithfully, like wouldn't have the settings correct on their phone or wouldn't carry their phone with them if they didn't trust it. So that became a really strong guiding principle. How can you make this a zero risk privacy proposition? And this is one of the reasons we supplemented the technical safeguards with such a strong terms of service at this time. After the API was formally launched, government started launching apps that used it, and it was really exciting. By the end of July, public health authorities had launched apps with this technology in 16 countries and regions all over the world, and the Association of Public Health Laboratories had agreed to host a US-wide server to support interstate operability. There were roughly 20 states working on developing apps of the technology at this time, so what APHL did was really instrumental because those apps needed to be able to work when people cross state borders. We were also continuously improving the Bluetooth technology. For example, at the end of July, we launched an update that improved the calibration. In the same period of time, we extensively expanded our documentation on the developer site. We improved our public-facing explanations and materials. We added videos and easy-to-understand explanations, and really invested in making those tools and those services more understandable. Throughout this period, based on our conversations with public health authorities, we had sort of a growing understanding that it was very challenging for them to develop these apps. So in September, we launched something called Exposure Notifications Express in the United States to help lighten the loads on the government. It's more of a building block system to launching an app, and this really accelerated launches in the US. So basically in the 6-month time period that you see reflected on your screen, the project was able to develop a technology that reliably works on both mobile operating systems, partner with governments all over the world to launch this technology in a way that keeps public health in focus and protect people's privacy, and ultimately to support the COVID response. This was a very intense 6 months. So where are we today? Public health authorities have launched apps in more than 55 countries, states, or regions, which is about an average of 2 launches per week, which is very, very impressive in terms of just getting technology out the door. We were also really honored to win Innovation of the Year from Popular Science, and part of their commentary was on our privacy and security standards. That was really an exciting recognition. We've had some really good success stories. These examples really show how we know the app is helping. Specifically, it shows that it's helping exposed people get tested, and it's helping contact tracing expand its reach. And those were 2 of the key things we wanted the technology to do. So this is good. What are some things we learned along the way? So switching from contact tracing to exposure notification really helped clarify our role in the response. It was a little bit challenging to do. That's the kind of thing that might typically be more behind the scenes, but it was a really important thing for us to do, and it was a really critical change that we made, so that was a good decision. We also learned that governments needed more support, which is where Exposure Notification Express came in, and Google also made ad grants available and other tools for governments to help promote their apps. We learned that proactive communication on privacy and phone settings was essential. Helping people understand how the technology worked was really challenging because it really was entirely novel. And so there weren't a lot of really clear things to compare it to. It's not like a lot of other things. So the work we did to create videos, to create more understandable materials was really an important step in this process. We also had some moments where there were some myths that were going around about this being automatically installed on your phone. And so we worked with third-party fact-checking organizations around the world to help ease those myths. We learned that transparency was essential, so making the code open source. Also the transparency of showing up and having conversations with people, things like changing the name, doing those things kind of out in the open were really important to the success of the project. We also learned to be humble. We engaged in a lot of conversations where we were not the experts in the room. Our goal was really always to bring our core competencies to the table, to make sure that our focus was on the things we do best and make sure we were supporting the people who knew best how to help with the pandemic. And the last thing I would say we learned was not to give up. There were a lot of moments where this felt like it might be impossible, where we faced a lot of really difficult conversations and challenges around the world. And yet I think we were able to navigate pretty well those challenges, and the technology is pretty widely launched and available today. So thank you so much for having me at this event, and I look forward to having a conversation with our co-panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us to talk today about privacy issues with coronavirus contact tracing apps. I'm Tiffany Lee, and I am a law professor at Boston University School of Law. I'm also a fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project, and I write a recurring column on technology and privacy for MSNBC. So I've been thinking about this topic quite a lot. As you can expect, it's a bit like that old saying, right? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. For me, as a privacy researcher, when I first started thinking about these contact tracing apps, all I saw were the privacy problems. That's not to say I don't use one, though. I currently have the contact tracing capability turned on my phone, and I encourage everybody I know in specific states to turn that on as well. And why specific states? We'll get into that a little bit later. Some of you may already know the answer. And here is when I would see if anyone in the audience was raising their hands. But as this is the recorded part of the conversation, I'm just going to assume that everyone is sort of nodding along and smiling. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the privacy and legal risks involved with the contact tracing apps. And we'll go over a few different things. So first, I want to situate us so we understand what we're talking about and have a common ground of understanding. Next, I'll look into some of the privacy risks involved with these apps, both the manual contact tracing as well as digital, and then looking at decentralized and centralized contact tracing apps. Then I'll look at the legal landscape. As an attorney and a law professor, I'll explain some of the legal issues involved with privacy and contact tracing applications. And finally, I'll give you a few suggestions for how I think we should move forward, thinking about how to protect our privacy in a time of pandemic, or really any time at all. So first, what are we talking about here? A few other speakers on this panel have talked to you or will talk to you about different types of contact tracing protocols. They've probably mentioned the specific privacy preserving techniques that some companies and some firms have been using. For example, the Apple and Google exposure notification tool. This tool is, of course, probably the most privacy preserving type that we could think about. And it's been implemented across various states in the US and in different countries around the world as part of contact tracing apps. Contact tracing apps are often used to supplement, but not to replace manual contact tracing. And by manual contact tracing, I just mean a human being calling you, asking if you had coronavirus, and then asking about every single person you may have contacted within the potential infectious period. So in lieu of that, we have these digital apps. Now, I think the first thing we have to recognize is that for all of us as technologists and as technology researchers, we may have gotten a bit too excited about the contact tracing apps in the beginning. Certainly, they are exciting in terms of the technology and the potential. But in reality, we haven't really seen them being implemented at a scale to which I would say these apps have really made a huge difference. And we'll talk about why that is. So first, let's look at the privacy risks involved with these apps. And there are obviously very many risks. Anytime you collect data of any kind, you have risks involved with that data collection, the data processing, the sharing, the storage, the deletion, and so on and so forth. Specifically here, we have an issue in terms of who is actually collecting the data and who has access to the data. Now, one reason why we haven't seen as much user adoption of these, even the privacy preserving contact tracing apps, is that very often people just don't trust either the government or companies to store their data. So when they hear, for example, that the state public health department has partnered with Apple and Google to create a new app, some people might not think that that's an app they actually want to download and use. And that's a problem. If we believe that contact tracing apps are important in solving the pandemic or in helping us for future types of pandemics or for future types of disease surveillance, we need to solve that core trust issue. And one way to do that is by using privacy-preserving protocols. So I'm very happy to see that we've seen decentralized contact tracing applications. We've seen privacy-preserving proposals. We've seen a lot of states even working on apps that try to do the best they can to make sure that data isn't abused or unauthorized or accessed in an unauthorized manner. This is important because there are many risks to the data being collected in contact tracing applications. Now, first of all, there is the major risk of this data being accessed by unauthorized actors. There's always a risk of hacking, no matter how secure your app or your company is. I think everybody at this conference knows that. So that's one major risk to always think about whenever we have some application that's collecting a lot of data, particularly the very sensitive type of health data that these apps might be collecting. We also have to think about potential misuse of data. And this could be a misuse of data from authorized actors. Of course, many people around the world have talked about government misuse of data, and that's something to consider as well. For example, recently, Singapore got into a bit of hot water when the government admitted that the data collected in their contact tracing app could be used for other government purposes, including potential criminal justice or law enforcement purposes. Now, this is highly problematic. First, because this disincentivizes people from using and downloading the app, which definitely harms the purpose of those apps and actually helping create better disease surveillance. But second, that's problematic because this conflation of types of data and types of actors who can access data can harm our civil liberties. It's harmful when the government can access data without limitations and without transparency. And there's always potential that governments may misuse their access to data and misuse the data collected by these contact tracing apps. So that's always a problem. There are other problems involved as well. Now, of course, there's a problem of not only hacking and potential misuse of data, but also what happens after the data is released. If we, for example, note that certain people at a certain company tested positive for coronavirus, there's potential for harassment, stigma, doxing, all of those different privacy invasion harms. There are also equity concerns. If we promote a privacy-preserving contact tracing application, that might be enough to get user adoption for some people. But we have to recognize that the privacy harms of unauthorized access to data, or of government or corporate abuse of data, those harms can be much worse for certain marginalized communities. In that case, those communities would not be able to benefit from whatever health benefits we might see from the contact tracing applications, leading to a greater divide in terms of digital equity. So there are many privacy risks, but we also have some potential legal solutions. Now, first, there has been much discussion about HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. HIPAA, however, is a little bit limited. While it does protect the privacy of transmission of specific types of health data, it only does so between specific parties, so covered healthcare entities like hospitals and clinics. There isn't as much of a focus or a regulatory enforcement ability for collection of this type of data from private parties. And similarly, if you think about the third-party application developers, there's also sometimes a lack of enforcement ability on the part of Google and Apple in terms of really cracking down on every single app that third-party developers create. So we have to think about those problems as well in terms of regulatory solutions. There are additional laws that apply. There are data breach notification laws that apply if there is a hack for any contact tracing application or any server storing the information, which of course is much more harmful in the case of a centralized contact tracing application or one that doesn't use a privacy-preserving Bluetooth standard. So there are these issues that the laws tries to help with, but can't really fully protect against. For example, data breach notification laws, we have a 50-state approach, but that really only helps you after the fact. That helps you after your data has already been accessed by unauthorized parties or exposed or leaked out to the public. There are a few other laws that also apply. We have additional federal and state level health privacy laws, including, for example, the 21st Century CARES Act. And we also have a category of law that just protects users as consumers. So consumer protection laws can be used to protect consumers using applications that may be developed even by non-public authorities. So private parties who develop these contact tracing apps would have to fall under, for example, the enforcement ability of the Federal Trade Commission, which makes sure that apps and companies can't, for example, do things like make misleading statements about privacy or cybersecurity. Now that's all well and good, but that doesn't do enough. We don't really have privacy for the data that we put in these apps. When we don't have that, because the greatest harm of all isn't something I think is related to the legal issues or even to the issues we've discussed about unauthorized access, about government abuse of data, about potential hacking, and so on. I think the greatest privacy problem we have with contact tracing applications is simply that they create a shift in our privacy norms. The greater use of these applications, as well as the greater use of health surveillance generally throughout this pandemic, has the potential to change the way we think about health privacy. So we start thinking that it's normal to always have an app on your phone created by the government that tracks your location all throughout the day. Now, of course, we know that there are some states that have implemented the more privacy-preserving, Bluetooth-based, decentralized contact tracing applications. And that is fantastic and should be applauded. But not all states have done this. It's very possible that other nations as well have been using a more traditional location tracking paradigm. Overall, what's important is that the consumer doesn't really know the difference. And because we don't know the difference, what's really happening is that people in America and around the world are becoming more used to having their data being collected generally. It becomes more normalized for governments and for corporations to have access to vast quantities of sensitive health data. And we have some laws that protect against this. For example, the health privacy laws I mentioned in the United States. Under the GDPR and other privacy laws around the world, health privacy or health data is often treated as a sensitive category of information. But it doesn't do enough. We need stronger laws and we need better overall societal understanding of what health privacy is and why it matters. We also need this understanding because health privacy is sometimes even more important or more critical than other forms of privacy in terms of information privacy. There is also the old saying that biometrics ought to be usernames, not passwords, because you can never really change your face. But similarly, you can't change your DNA. You can't change the health information that is collected about you at a certain time, whether or not you've had coronavirus in the past, whether or not you have pre-existing conditions. All that information is unique to you and extremely important for multiple facets of your life as a person in society. And for these reasons, I think the privacy and legal issues involved with coronavirus testing and coronavirus tracing apps aren't limited to simply the issues in terms of what the technology can do. But what we really have to think about is how to protect privacy moving forward and how to shift those norms of privacy back so we can protect ourselves not only now, but after the pandemic and after the next one and after the next one after that. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to our panel discussion.
Good morning. My name is Mike Judd. I'm an epidemiologist and computer scientist at the CDC, and I lead a collaboration between the agency-wide COVID-19 emergency response and the Office of the Chief Information Officer, known as the COVID-19 Exposure Notification Initiative. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my perspective this morning alongside my distinguished colleagues. In the next 10 minutes, I want to discuss interdisciplinary problem solving and explore the nature and value of the relationships that have been formed within and between the public health community and the tech sector since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll highlight the innovations these relationships have produced and how these innovations have led to some early successes in state-led implementations of the Google and Apple exposure notification system. First, many of these relationships are new, and building them has required a mindful, trusting approach to unite these largely independent communities. Promoting an inclusive environment has led to the blurring of boundaries between public health and technology and served to facilitate the innovations achieved. To put this all a bit more simply, it takes a village. Public health practitioners, governments, and public figures often lead in the implementation of non-pharmaceutical interventions for infectious disease outbreaks. But exposure notification is different and requires a unique community of practice to be implemented. Public health can't do it without technologists, and technologists can't do it without public health. Parochialism, both at an organizational level and within and across technical domains, can prevent the kind of cross-pollination needed to address unprecedented challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, the CDC and our early collaborators, like the Association of Public Health Labs, MIT Lincoln Laboratory, and Linux Foundation Public Health, sought to establish a community of practice to provide states, territories, and university systems with the interdisciplinary support needed to implement innovative solutions to mitigating the pandemic. In dark blue, you see the jurisdictions we've worked with. They include those curious about, developing, or in production with a solution leveraging the Google Apple exposure notification system. Over time, we've engaged with many organizations and provided ample opportunities for implementing jurisdictions to share their experiences, learn from one another, and hear from thought leaders, both from within and outside the traditional public health community. We've also connected states with asynchronous information sharing resources like the Linux Foundation Public Health Slack workspace, as well as webinars and other real-time forums for discussion. The cornerstone of our approach was our Exposure Notification Learning Lab, which served as the convening body and biweekly forum for consensus building. We've held 13 meetings so far, and each one tends to have between 35 and 50 participants, hailing from between 9 to 17 jurisdictions, although on the whole, we've had representation for all jurisdictions with live implementations. We founded this community of practice on guiding principles that mitigate insular decision-making. First and foremost, we default to a permissive dialogue. This means including developers in public health discussions and including epidemiologists in technical discussions. Next, become comfortable with being uncomfortable. To a certain extent, all of us are learning new things and maybe having fundamental perspectives challenged. It's incumbent on us to assume positive intent and seek common ground. Also, embrace agility and iteration and know that there will be breaking changes. This applies equally to the rapid iteration that the exposure notification API underwent early in the pandemic, as well as pivots from public health with relation to best practices as we strive to implement the latest findings. Finally, speak candidly and share results often. Regular presentations at the Learning Lab from jurisdictions on lessons learned has helped scale the effectiveness to all implementations. Linux Foundation Public Health has served a particularly critical role here, helping to distill best practices and posting FAQs on their websites on topics as varied as legal language in the procurement process to risk configuration recommendations for state health apps. In addition to the interdisciplinary support provided by the community of practice, innovative thinking has flourished at the state level. It's manifested as state government and technology collaboratives and collaborative public awareness campaigns, and has served as a driver of successful implementations of the Google and Apple exposure notification system. And the focus on privacy and equity has reaffirmed the most important relationship of all, the one with the general public. For instance, a collaboration between the University of Arizona and the We Health nonprofit and the state health department resulted in a technical innovation that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the Google and Apple exposure notification system. These collaborators leveraged an early version of the API to inculcate the latest findings on transmission risk into their campus app and provide specific public health messaging based on more nuanced exposure levels. Colorado benefited from a state-led innovations program. The Colorado Digital Service, modeled after the US Digital Service, embedded software engineers, designers, product managers, and procurement specialists into the health department. This led to Colorado pioneering the use of an innovative method to automate a portion of the diagnosis verification process. New Jersey also had a state-led innovation program, the New Jersey Office of Innovation, which assisted with the rollout of New Jersey's app and contributed to the regional collaborative that saw New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware release state-branded apps based on the same open source code base. Finally, Washington State used creative marketing approaches, like getting the lead singer of Pearl Jam to encourage Washington residents to opt into exposure notification. They also lived out their commitment to inclusion by translating the public health messaging in their app into 36 different languages. Although this broad community of practice has succeeded in innovative ways, there is still more for us to do, especially in the realm of evaluating the public health effectiveness of this technology. In a truly agile and iterative way, the community is continuing to balance the need for data collection and feedback loops with the need to maintain the trust of the public through private and secure implementations. Recent progress in this domain has provided more visibility into user metrics. An opt-in based approach for users to contribute more telemetry data is beginning to enable aggregate statistics to be gathered per implementing jurisdiction. These data points are available to health authorities in implementing jurisdictions via an analytics portal created by Apple and Google and hosted by NIH and MITRE. Early adopters are gaining visibility into the number of active app users, the number of positive diagnoses entered into the apps, the number of exposure alerts they trigger, the speed of notification of contacts, and the number of contacts opening, dismissing, or ignoring their exposure alerts. Many of these metrics will assist the community in comparing the effectiveness of exposure notification to manual contact tracing and better articulate the relative contributions of each approach to the mitigation of transmission. In response, CDC has extended the Learning Lab approach for implementers using the analytics portal to facilitate these analyses. In closing, I hope that the nature and value of the relationships that have been formed within and between the public health community and the tech sector since the beginning of the pandemic is clear. And I hope these experiences raise yet more questions on how to sustain the progress that we've made and increase the effectiveness of this interdisciplinary dialogue. For instance, where do these relationships go when the pandemic concludes? Which ones remain and what makes them durable? And how can we generalize what we've learned and apply those lessons to persistent issues like the modernization of public health IT infrastructure and better integration of electronic lab and case reporting data across the local, state, and territorial and federal landscapes? Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you, panelists. It's time for questions. We have a number of them, and panelists, if you can turn on your video and audio, that would be great. So pleased to have folks on this panel. Obviously, everybody who's working on this is so incredibly busy, as you can all imagine. So I'm happy that we have them for a nice extended Q&A session. So I will be asking the questions to make sure that we get as many of them as possible, and I will do my best to give credit to folks who ask the questions in Slack. I hope I don't butcher too many names. I apologize in advance if I do. So let's get going. We have a question from Nathan. It's either Buck or Buke. I apologize for my pronunciation again, which is, did privacy preserving mechanisms like randomized Wi-Fi and Bluetooth MAC addresses impact the feasibility or effectiveness of technology-driven contact tracing? And maybe Marcel, if you want to kick us off, for example, but any other panelists, feel free to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think I would pass on the technical details to our colleagues from the more technical side. But in general, I mean, questions like these came up all the time, which essentially reflect this question around, right, how far are you going to go in terms of preservation of privacy, and then what is the impact on that from an epidemiological perspective? And I think, I mean, there you really have to get into the details at some point. I mean, I also saw other questions that I found quite interesting that we can maybe speak about later, where you could say, well, you know, if you tweak the protocol in such a way, you could actually potentially answer this interesting epidemiological question, but you would give up some privacy. And the stance that we took in the beginning was always to say that we don't want to try to solve too many problems at once, right? That there was, in epidemiological circles, there was a huge desire to use this kind of tool also to tackle epidemiological questions that you normally cannot tackle with the classical approaches. And you know, it pained me in my heart that is you know, at bottom an epidemiologist, but we sort of said, you know, that let's not try to go down that route at first, right? Let's just try to build something that helps the manual contact tracers as much as possible, and let's do that at the maximum privacy preservation that can possibly be achieved. And then once that's sorted out, right, down the road, as this technology gets developed and gets taken up and gets discussed, we can talk about you know, other points on this trade-off curve that I showed. So that's sort of a, yeah, I hope that answers that question a little bit.
Thanks, Marcel. Ali, did you want to jump in and talk about the Google point of view?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben, and thanks, Marcel. I agree with what Marcel was saying. I think that from our point of view, when we were making decisions about how the technology would work, the sentiment was really that privacy was not kind of an extra thing that we were adding on in order to convey a message, but was really essential to the success of the technology itself. So I think the way that you might contemplate the trade-off is less, if you had the same number of participants and you knew more about those participants, would that be better for epidemiological research? But rather, how does the privacy kind of promise of the technology determine the number of participants that you have? And our sense was that making a really high privacy promise, really making sure people felt that there was basically zero risk in joining the technology, or sorry, using the technology and joining this effort, would encourage more participants. So I guess that was how I would frame it, less, you know, the sort of hypothetical question of, given the same number of participants, is more information more helpful? I think Marcel covered that kind of question really well, but how does the privacy assurance determine the number of people who participate? And for our sense, having a really high privacy promise was the way to get people to join in and use this technology.
Yeah, and if I can jump in real quick, just to add on to what Ali was saying, to address a little bit more of the technical side of things, I think it worked out really nicely the way that Google and Apple put together this temporary exposure key architecture, and how it reflected a lot of the epidemiological characteristics of exposure. Essentially what the process is this rotating identifier that you know, reduces likelihood of people, you know, sniffing for phones proximities over a certain amount of time. And it was essentially once per day, it would rotate on the whole. And that sort of corresponded with its nature of, as CDC sort of changed or augmented the understanding of exposure to be cumulative across the day, it was sort of a one-to-one mapping of their privacy preserving approach that allowed for exposure information to be collected across a single day. So it was nice to see that convergence and have that all be a privacy preserving approach, you know, working all in with the epidemiologic aspect as well.
Excellent. All right, well, let me jump to a question. I'm going to merge a question from Alejandro Hevia and Alex Tibbles, which just to review a little bit of the information on effectiveness. Is this working? And I know some of the panelists touched on this, but maybe there's more information you can provide on that. Maybe, you know, how effective is it in general? Do we have data on how many infections have been prevented? And what's the difference in effectiveness when there was low spread in countries where there is high spread? If we can give a little bit more color on that, that would be really helpful. And that can be whoever wants to jump in on the panel there.
Hey, I can take a first stab, though. Maybe it looks like Mike wants to jump into. So I'll just be brief. The question is a really good one, obviously very important and essential to understand how this technology is working. There have been a couple of studies that I would point to help us understand the efficacy. The first one was something that was produced by Oxford in collaboration with Google. They published a modeling study and they sort of looked at what the potential real world impact of the exposure notifications would be under different conditions. So some of the things you described, Ben. And what they found is that even at low levels of adoption, exposure notifications can reduce the number of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths from COVID-19. We have seen some evidence of this in the apps that we know about. So I've seen a lot of questions come through Slack and other places about download rates and things like this. Just worth noting quickly that that information belongs to the public health authorities or the developers. So there are some insights available where they've shared it in the press or other places. So for example, the stats that I shared earlier in my talk were from public resources. So like California has already got 25% downloads. That was something that the public health authority shared. But there's actually also a really recent study as well from Nature that studied the case in Spain. So it was not a modeled study like Oxford, but a real one that went over 4 weeks and studied the Spanish app, which is called Radar COVID. And they found that like 30% of the population had adopted the technology and it was able to detect over 6 close contacts per infected individual, which was about 2 times higher than the average using manual contact tracing. And so I think what's important about what that found is that exposure notification technology is sort of working as intended, right? It is amplifying the effect of contact tracing. It is making things easier, helping folks who might have been exposed understand that, and not replacing it. So that was really important. Just worth noting, and I think Mike can probably expand on this, that the Nature study also noted that the key ingredient to success was the type of campaigns or public health outreach that Mike described in his talk. And I'm so glad that that Washington State video got a shout out. It is truly awesome. And if you have not watched it, you absolutely should.
Yeah, thank you, Ellie. So I just want to kind of take a little bit higher level view. I definitely defer to Marcel as he and his colleagues have done a lot of the really deep and robust work so far and kind of pioneered some of these studies in Switzerland. But I think that in general, looking at effectiveness, you can take it for, you can think about it in intermediate outcomes or ultimate outcomes. From the public health perspective, the ultimate outcome is always the intervention, which would be, health protective behaviors, whether that's encouraging mask usage. In the case of a confirmed positive case, it would be quarantine. And that is something that's very difficult to measure in an app that doesn't, measure anything after or have any sort of geolocation or any mechanism for confirming, personal health behavior. What is useful, I think, and what I think we're able to start to get a little bit closer to is determining some of these intermediate outcomes, like the average decrease in time to contact notification in the exposure notification type solution versus manual contact tracing. And if that is a significant reduction in time between when a manual contact tracer would be able to reach out to an individual on the phone and alert them of a potential exposure versus what can be done in an automated fashion through proximity detection. And then also in that same arena, the comprehensiveness of identification. So, manual contact tracing by nature of eliciting contacts from somebody of a known positive case, they don't know the people they don't know, so they don't know the community contacts that they may have exposed, and it's difficult to get in touch with them. That's another potential avenue for exposure notification to add more value there in alerting more contacts, especially those that are in the community. And then the accuracy of the or the positive predictive value. I think that's something that we're interested in getting a better handle on, so that the right people are alerted versus a large number of people or not the right people, like the people, like not enough people are alerted to reduce unnecessary quarantine, while at the same time trying to reduce transmission by identifying the right people that would serve to benefit from a quarantine, or the community would serve to benefit.
Maybe if I can just add one point, which I think is important, and thanks, is like one of the challenges we actually had, and I assume that's similar in other places, is actually about the process into which the app was integrated, right? And so when you ask, how well does exposure notification work, that's a very difficult question for all the reasons that also Mike just mentioned. But in reality, right, also the whole technology is then embedded in a public health process in which a lot of things can unfortunately go wrong, right? That's not a criticism, but that's just the reality. For example, in Switzerland, I think in many other countries, you have to get a code, right, to activate the exposure notification in the first place. But if that code doesn't get delivered on time due to whatever problem, then the epidemiological impact will be very weak, and that has nothing to do with the exposure notification. I mean, it's sort of, yeah, it's a well-known problem in epidemiology. You can test, for example, the efficiency of a vaccine, and you can do that in a sort of lab setting if you have that set up. But then the real world efficaciousness is a whole different story, because that depends, right? Was the vaccine sort of stored at the right temperature and all of that stuff? And so I think we'll have a lot of work cut out for us for the future to really sort of disentangle these many factors, and the privacy preserving nature of that makes it hard. But that's a good thing, right? It's supposed to be hard.
If I can riff on that for just a second, I think this point you brought up, Marcel, about like, we've got this technology, it's great, but then we have to get this code to the person, right? And to make sure they activate it in time. It's like we got the hard part, and then this part, which is, quote, easy, but obviously not, it is where there might be some failures. What are some of these? Do we have any other anecdotes or points about things that maybe the tech crowd thinks is easy or obvious, but turns out not so much in the real world, especially in this context? And I open it up to any of the panelists who want to talk about these interesting lessons. Maybe things that we thought would be easy turn out to be hard, or we always knew would be hard, but the tech public doesn't understand that.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to dominate the discussion here, but as you just said that, yeah, quite a few things come to mind, and it's sort of goes back to that slide about the trade-off curve, and where people say, well, you don't get right, where people from both fields sort of don't understand the challenges in the other field, and then, but also, of course, to some extent, the solutions that people have already. That people have actually already thought about this. I mean, to give you one example, right? One thing that really puzzled me back in 2020 was, for example, a blog post by Bruce Schneier, right? And I think, he's probably, as far as I can tell, he's a respected member of your community. But it was sort of a blog post about, digital contact tracing is obviously completely dumb. And here are the two reasons why that is, right? And you sort of read the arguments, and as an epidemiologist, you sort of feel a little bit nervous about this, because the sort of the quality of the argument basically says people haven't really thought about this from an epidemiological perspective, right? And it's sort of really trivial problems, and of course there's an entire field that has thought about this for 30 years, right? And yes, we have thought about false negatives, and we have also heard about false yeah, you get the idea. So that's been sometimes a little bit challenging. Not to say, well, this person doesn't get it, but this thing gets immediately picked up in the media around the world, right? Renowned privacy expert, and that's actually made the work quite challenging in unexpected ways. I mean, if we have a debate, right, like we can have here about the pros and cons, and we hear each other out, and then we go back to work, that's one thing. But if you're in the middle of sort of building this thing that you want to get on the road within a month, and you have this this sort of public conversation at the relatively low level, that's been somewhat challenging. And this is why I come back to this argument that it's really important that we establish these communities and these bridges way before, and I hope there will be other opportunities like this conference where we don't talk about these things after the fact, but also before the fact.
That's fantastic, Marcel. Anybody else want to jump in on like anecdotes or unexpected learnings, or maybe expected if you're an expert in your field, like Marcel mentioned, but not so obvious to the rest of the world, especially who are not in the discipline?
Sure, I can add some. So I think that something that people who are not in public health for 30 years may have been surprised by were just how few people actually wanted to download the app, even after knowing that it works. And I think that's something that, I am sure that there have been studies on adoption and how to get people interested in using apps and how to make people feel like their privacy is secure. But when it actually comes down to it, most of the common folks don't know what these apps are. And this is a really specialized audience, right? I mean, everyone here, we understand why certain types of exposure notification protocols are more privacy preserving than others. We understand what it means when data is kept in a centralized server versus in a decentralized manner. But the general public doesn't know these things. And all they know is that a scary government or a scary company is putting out an app and they don't want to download it. So I think that's something that may not have been surprising, but we should have maybe worked harder on. Although of course it was pretty difficult to do, I would say last year, particularly in the US, given the political situation in the US. So I can't really fault anyone for that. I think everyone tried the best they could. But definitely there was a lack of institutional faith. And I don't know if things are even really turning around now, or if it's still pretty similar to last year in terms of individual faith in institutions like public health departments. But this is I think the core problem that a lot of us have been thinking about and dealing with, how to make not only the tech safer, but how to make it more apparent to people that the tech is safer, and how to educate the public and make the public aware. And these issues, I think, are all part and parcel of the privacy problem too, because people know that they care about privacy, and they know their data is being taken and being used, but they just don't know how to preserve or how to protect themselves. So they just get scared and they don't use the apps. And if the apps are helpful for public health, we need to figure out a way to make them, interesting and usable for people too.
That's great. I'm going to riff on that, Tiffany, because that leads into one of the questions I had specifically teed up for you. I'm using my moderator's privilege. There's not that many, but there's one, which is I get to ask questions. But I love the point you made about, shifting norms and how do you gain the public trust? And I'm struck by the fact that, most of us carry cell phones, and we know that the cell phones have given us benefits, and there's been trade-offs in terms of privacy, in terms of, and I mean this not in recent years, I mean just over the last 10 to 20 years, just the adoption of the internet, the adoption of cell phones, like there's been trade-offs in privacy. And yet here we are with potentially a huge benefit to these cell phones, right? Like, wow, we could do this fast contact tracing in a way that we haven't been able to do before. And if it's implemented properly, we can even do it in a way that doesn't have privacy downsides. But how does the consumer know the difference between the good app and the bad app, right? The app that's going to do it the right way and the app that's going to do it poorly. And this is potentially an impossible question to answer. So, but I will ask it anyways. How do we build that trust, right? Like, how do we communicate as a society? How do we convey this properly to users? How do we build the trust that this is the app that's going to have the benefit, but not the downside? Because it just feels like a bummer if, we have these cell phones and we don't get the wins that they can potentially offer.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sure many of you have heard this, but people have joked that the sci-fi show Black Mirror is basically what if phones but too much, right? Because it's all about how technology can go crazy and do terrible things. And I bet it sounds like what you're asking is, what if phones but too little, right? Like, what if we're not able to use and benefit from the technology because we're so scared of it? And that's, I think, a real concern. I think it's a concern that definitely, people at at the tech companies and people in public health departments have been working on. For all the reasons that many of us have talked about already, people are concerned. And I'm interested in, sort of on that point, was a little discussion on Slack actually about the idea of, why isn't there a national contact tracing app? And thinking through, if there was, say, an official US federal contact tracing app, would that actually make things seem more legitimate? And I'm not sure about that. So Mike made a few comments about why, it could actually maybe even be beneficial for there not to be a national app. And I previously, in a previous op-ed, wrote about why I think there actually should be, or there needs to be interoperability at least. I think that is difficult because, as Ben mentioned, right now we have, maybe 50 different apps for 50 different states. Some of them are designed in the best privacy preserving manners, of which many of us have talked about today, but some of them are not. And some of them are designed by developers and companies that we can sort of trust to be doing the right thing in terms of privacy, and some of them are not. And for an individual consumer, it's extremely hard to know the difference. So that's something to think about. And thinking about if there could be some sort of at least a national standard or a framework, outside the existing frameworks that have been published and that all of us know about, to make people understand the differences and to know how to choose a contact tracing app. Given though that most of the time they don't really have a choice. If you live in Arkansas, you're going to use the Arkansas app. There's nothing else you can do. You can't just decide to use the California app. That's not going to work out for you. So thinking through, how to create those national standards while not disincentivizing people from using certain apps if they're maybe not perfect.
Thanks, Tiffany. Anybody else want to jump in on this question of public trust, which I imagine if Marcel would say, yeah, epidemiologists have been dealing with that since the beginning of time in these contact traces, or maybe Mike, but any lessons from the epidemiology side of the house, Mike and Marcel, in terms of how do you build trust with the public in a pandemic, with the contact tracer calling them up and it's asking them where they've been, and any other activities that epidemiologists need to know about?
I think that it has to do with consistent messaging, and I think it has to do with, at least for the exposure notification side, it needs, as we've seen, some positive, public campaigns, as I mentioned in my slides. It needs support from local trusted figures. So, the fact that Washington State had the endorsement of, the lead singer of Pearl Jam. They also, which I didn't mention, they also had Starbucks statewide send out, a positive, message, endorsing the solution to all of the folks in Washington State that had the Starbucks app, I think it was, or via some other, marketing mechanism. Things like that, where the community that people trust, that they interact with on a regular basis, give some credence to the solution as that it's at least safe, if not effective. I think that's a major, a major driver of trust from the public. But I think, there is a certain component of just apathy or COVID fatigue, where people have been hearing about this, for the past year, and people are tired of hearing about it, tired of continue to engage in this despite the need for continued efforts to reduce infection. And so, not to steal fire from Ali and Google and Apple folks, but the value of the push notifications that went out on the iOS devices for giving people 2 or 3 clicks right on their home screen to get opted in, that drove adoption much faster, even than the public campaigns for the local trusted figures. And so giving people the option right there and making it easy is effective as well. And I think those two things playing together with gaining public trust and making it easy for people to use it, really add a lot to getting people on board.
Awesome. All right, we're gonna go from like a meaty question here on trust and the meaning of life and everything to something a little bit more bite-sized, just to kind of answer some questions on key facts, just to bring everybody up to speed. There's a question from Carrie Parker. Why in the US did we require each state to create their own app that used the Google Apple framework? Will there be a universal app for the US? That was mentioned in the context of trust, but just purely in the sense of like, why is it being done this way? And maybe Mike, that might just go straight to you.
Sure, I can start with that one. And I think Tiffany will probably have the best legal language here. But essentially, and I got a great history lesson relatively recently, that authorities and responsibilities not specifically given to the federal government are given to the state. And public health was one of those. And there's not really been much of a change in that. Tiffany can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But essentially, that's sort of the what's spawned the more federated states' rights approach to public health. That's the way it's been for since the beginning, I suppose. And so CDC's role is to support state, local, territorial, and tribal health departments in their implementations of solutions, and not to be the central sort of authority on saying what those states have to do. So there's a lot that the CDC can't mandate or can't regulate. For instance, in the realm of food safety, FDA and USDA are actually the ones that have the regulatory authority for food recalls and things like that. CDC has the investigatory role there. It's something where we are primarily the meat and potatoes of what we do is support states implementing their solution. For better or for worse, but that's essentially why you see this kind of proliferation of state-led solutions. I will indicate, though, that I get a little bit deeper into some of the nuances of some of the value of having state-level or state-run approaches, in that it can help better localize and contextualize the solution, and it can help them, better plan resources for testing, since there's a lot of an app is a small portion of a larger public health response to COVID-19, and downstream effects of having an app that's, if they're using the exposure notification solution, one that has a sensitive threshold, getting more people to receive alerts, and then telling those people to go get testing, that obviously results in an increased testing utilization. So states have to be aware of how scalable their resources are to accommodate something like that. Other instances where case validation is something at the state level, where as you're counting cases and things to help with your surveillance and your resource allocation for targeted interventions, you need to know those things. So having it at the state level adds value there. I think that I'll cut off there because I've said a lot of different things. I let other panelists or others jump in and comment.
You mentioned Tiffany would have some more background. Tiffany, if I can throw it to you.
Sure. So it's interesting, I think, that all of us are asking questions about the areas that are maybe not our specific expertise, because I'm really interested in asking other questions as well. So I know a number of states have joined to, make the apps a little interoperable, right? They have, they use a national key server, which I think is developed. I'm not sure. I don't think it's by the CDC, but that's not every state, right? And definitely, yes, legally you can't, or it may be difficult to mandate, say, a national app, but you could have backend support, like supporting this national key server, right? Or having a national campaign of awareness, which is something the CDC often does and has done. So I think that's still interesting. And on a sort of wonky legal point, I think a lot of these administrative law questions about who can do what on a federal or state level, which agency can do what, and so on. A lot of it is actually not, I would say, as set in stone, and more of kind of an interpretation of legal authorities sometimes. So here, I think that there could be more that could be done in terms of working together between different states and having more federal guidance. And I know that, this, I'm sure you can't really talk too much about this, but, we've read other reports about how, the CDC and other agencies were a bit hamstrung last year in terms of being able to push out some information. But hopefully we can have more information out there now and more guidance to consumers and individuals, because I think the public trust issue is really important. And thinking through if we can sort of encourage more interoperability between the state apps. I think this will be something that is also important, not the topic of this panel, but as we get into the sort of post-vaccine world, where we need to have some sort of record, potentially a digital record of vaccinations, we'll have to think through an interoperable state-by-state / federal approach, or even an international approach, so we can share that information. So those are, just a bit of my thoughts on this. It's important now for contact tracing, but it's also going to be important for vaccine verification too, and for other public health reasons as well.
Great. A question that I'll tack on to that, and anybody can take this one, Ali, if this is for you or Mike, which is, so we have a number of, this is again a little bit US centric, but it could also apply in Europe, Marcel, if there are issues of folks traveling. The question is about traveling. Folks are traveling, whether they should or not is a different question, but they're traveling. And so what are what are some of the interoperability aspects here that arise that Tiffany's mentioning? Are the states within the US sharing data? Are countries within Europe sharing data? And by sharing data, I mean, the key servers and whatnot that would allow the notifications to be cross-state or transnational. Any insights you want to provide on that?
Yes, it's a great question. Definitely one of the topics that we had been faced with from the beginning. So the first challenge of interoperability was between the operating systems, right, which is what was solved through the partnership. This question of interoperability between apps was sort of the next big question. In the United States, the work that APHL did to host the diagnosis key server should make any state that's participating in that process interoperable. Tiffany's made a good point that there are states that are not using the Google Apple exposure notification system. So I think that's a separate question. You would have to cabin out those folks. But what APHL is doing is a really big deal in terms of making the US interoperable and helping create a single solution there. I don't know if Marcel or others want to talk about the interoperability efforts in Europe. I think that is something that was also massively important and an early on decision. I don't know, sorry, I don't want to speak to folks, something that other folks might know more about. So I will leave Europe to Marcel, or if Mike has anything more to add on the US.
Nothing in particular. Just to echo that, yeah, APHL has done a wonderful job. We funded a lot of the infrastructure that they've been able to build and work with Microsoft on as well for hosting a lot of their services. They have a verification server as well that provides a common portal for verifying the diagnosis and mitigating that issue of potential bad actors injecting a lot of diagnosis keys that are false into the system. APHL and all of them have been really great to work with, and it's as you've said, allowed that interoperability for cross-jurisdiction exposure alerts to occur.
Yeah, I mean, on the European level, this was on our radar from day one. For obvious reasons, and there have been solutions, and there is at the EU level a hub to enable that interoperability. I think a number of countries are using it. Switzerland, not being part of the EU, obviously had to find alternative solutions, and it's been, yeah, I mean, the Swiss situation aside, that's sort of also been a lecture again and again, right? That many of these things at the end of the day are technically feasible, but really just don't have serious roadblocks on the political side of things. And that is something that I think this pandemic has unfortunately shown on many sides. I mean, whether, it's contact tracing, interoperability, vaccine nationalism, or what have you. The virus keeps reminding us on a daily basis that it doesn't give a damn about nations and borders, and we just don't seem to learn that message somehow. It's one of the sad things.
Mike, you said something that connects to a question by Nathan in the queue, which is, have we seen abuse of the Google Apple exposure notification stuff? And by abuse, I imagine the question goes to, spurious notification claims of exposure that are not true, or are meant to overwhelm the system, or anything like that. Folks trying to abuse this either within the system or to use it for nefarious purposes that are not related to exposure notification. Anything you can share, Ali? I don't know if there's anything you can share on your end on that.
Just that we were aware of some concern about the potential to use it during the last presidential election to create, some sort of alerts going to people that were poll workers or keep people out of the polls. Fortunately, that didn't come to pass. We're not aware of any actual abuse that has occurred, which is, I would say, it's been actually remarkable given the broad user base and the intense media scrutiny of this new solution that we've had. No significant abuses. Everybody, knock on wood.
That's great. Ali, if there's anything you want to add, that's great. Otherwise, I'm happy to move on to the next question.
I think that covered pretty much the key points. I agree. So far, so good, and knock on wood.
Great. All right, let me pull up my next question here. Let me go, actually, maybe stay with you, Ali. I want to take it in a different direction. You gave us a really interesting timeline, compressed timeline of how quickly you had to move in both in your collaboration with Apple and your collaboration with epidemiologists and whatnot. And I want to ask, decisions came so fast at Google in particular. How did you make these decisions? What resources were you able to draw from to inform those decisions, to do the analysis, to make the recommendations? It feels like it went really fast, and it was particularly public in terms of the sharing of the progress before it was launched and whatnot. So anything you can tell us about how that came about would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate this question because I think that you're exactly right on the timeline. You're exactly right under the pressure and the intensity of the decision making. It felt like folks in every sector were making dozens of difficult decisions every day, and there were sort of varying degrees of precedents that people could refer to or information that was out there. In a lot of ways for this project, it felt like the most relevant work. Obviously, there was a great body of relevant work. Marcel's point on 30 years of epidemiological research and things like this, but the most relevant work was less than 3 months old. And so if you published something, even if it was like a Twitter thread about digital contact tracing, especially in those early days, I almost guarantee I read it. We were looking everywhere for any information people were putting out. There was a weekend I remember particularly well, really early on, where we were reading, I spent the weekend reading some of the early research that had come out of Asia. South Korea in particular put out a really helpful paper early on how they were using data to support contact tracing. All of that work was really instrumental in sort of helping us build understanding of how phones were helping or not, or what role they were playing in the contact tracing process as sort of a supplemental feature of it. And so there was this really intense period of time where we were reading everything folks were putting out. In my case, I was often reading these articles while watching Contagion in the background, which was a pretty helpful note on contact tracing as well for someone who's coming in cold. The other thing that was happening throughout this period is we were having folks everywhere, but one thing I think might be interesting to share is that there were literally hundreds of meetings. We were basically taking a meeting with anybody who would share their expertise and give feedback. So healthcare experts, epidemiologists, governments, security researchers, privacy advocates, consumer advocates, human rights advocates, hundreds and hundreds of meetings trying to understand how people were understanding this new problem, how people were interpreting other people's guidance. It was a really interesting and fulfilling period of time, getting feedback, getting criticism, looking at that, considering how we can incorporate it. And so in particular, I wanted to thank, and there were people all over the world who were doing it, but thank folks from Access Now, CDT, ACLU, EFF, Public Knowledge, Open Technology Institute, all the organizations in Europe that put out research early on, all the governments from Asia who put out research, all of that helped us calibrate the understanding of what was going on. And I know that those people who wrote that work were also acting under pretty intense circumstances. We're also sort of developing insights, with uncertainty. And I really appreciate the speed with which people put that information out there. So I think that was a really important part of the process. And Mike really described it well in saying that there was an increased, I don't know if it was an increased openness exactly, but certainly an increased urgency to having those conversations that made the conditions of the conversations a little bit different from what you would typically find over a longer period of time. And I think a lot of that was to the benefit of the effort and to those relationships overall. So I think it's just a really important thing to acknowledge that the sheer volume of work and thought leadership that was happening around the world on this issue really quickly. And again, looking back at that 6-month time frame, a lot of that work was iterated on over time, but really came out in basically the first 3 to 4 months. And so I just really want to thank everybody who worked on that stuff. Even people who were critical, we took all of that in stride. And I think it was incredibly helpful to have all of those resources be available relatively quickly.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to have a couple more questions that are more targeted at one panelist, just to hear a little more of each of your story. One for Marcel. Marcel, you're like the epidemiologist that's like the privacy advocate's best friend, because you're talking about data minimization in your talk, right? Which is like music to a privacy advocate's ears. And I think you have a message for epidemiologists of like, hey, maybe we don't need all that data, but we can do the work and find that the right trade-off, right? Is there anything you would push privacy folks on and say, because you talked about the trade-off in both directions, right? Anything you would push privacy folks on in epidemiology, in this case, or more broadly, to help folks that are focusing on, that are experts in privacy but don't understand the epidemiology as much, to say, look, like there's a lot of value here. Yes, of course, there's a trade-off, right? Just like there was a trade-off for epidemiologists, you got a little less data, but there's a value here on the privacy front. A lot of privacy folks in the audience, how would you push us, right? And how would you push the privacy folks to think about the societal benefits, even if there are some privacy risks? And it could be about COVID-19, or it could be about the next pandemic and the other aspects of epidemiology.
Yeah, it's a good question. Not sure I have a good answer. I mean, I think you're right. I think we both obviously need to learn from each other and sort of try to bend this curve, right, as much as we can. I mean, in a perfect world, there would be a curve that is just at the top right, that just has total privacy guarantees and full health impact. And if we just accept that this point does not exist, right, then we need to have a discussion about, how can we get as close to the optimum as possible. And I think that's actually, frankly, I mean, this pandemic is really, a bad experience for everyone. But it's even though it seems weird right now to say this, but it's going to pass, right? And then we're back to all the other health problems that we have, and all the other sensitive health data that we collect, and all the other epidemiology that we do. Also not in non-communicable diseases, which are, nowadays in most countries actually the major burden, if it's not for the occasional pandemic. And there, right, the discussions around, digital health records and all of that stuff, I think is just as worrying, and as challenging, right? I mean, we mentioned it a couple of times, right? If we get this right, then the health benefits can actually be quite tremendous, but we can make a few false decisions that seem small decisions, but that have reverberations, certainly from a privacy perspective, that can be enormous, that will then feed back because people may then just not trust the technology, as we discussed before, and may not use it, and it can lead us to just a weird space. So, I mean, more than anything, I was extremely happy about the role of the privacy community that really pushed this technology, because the danger, right, was to me always that eventually we say, you know what, let's just forget about these privacy concerns. Let's solve this pandemic right now, right? And then accidentally, I think we would have built a huge surveillance apparatus and collected hugely damaging contact network data that we would maybe have discovered in 5 years, right? That were sort of stored by people who shouldn't have stored them, and all these stories. So I'm incredibly grateful that we had this push from the privacy community. You know, let's not make this happen. In fact, in Europe, my own observation was that we were on a path to sort of having majorities for a centralized solution, and it was thanks to really strong activism from the privacy community, mostly where I've seen it in Germany and the UK, but elsewhere too, that sort of you know, made the ship turn in the last minute. And then of course, you know, everything that Apple and Google eventually ended up implementing. But I think that was incredibly important. And so if I just have one message, it's, you know, please keep doing what you're doing. But also, right, so I mean, it's also a call to my own community. Like we should work together more before these things happen already, because let's not wait for the next pandemic, right? There's tons of health problems out there that require our attention, and it should just be a normal collaboration.
Thanks for that message, Marcel. Before I ask Tiffany the next question, anybody want to add to what Marcel said? I want to make sure the panel gets a chance to speak up.
I think I would just echo his sentiment. You know, we're grateful to the privacy community, and I also agree. You know, without too much kind of putting a feather in our hat. I mean, I think that it was a remarkable example of restraint from you know, across big tech, the federal government, you know, global institutions, where the opportunity to have this major influx of data on all sorts of things, you know, presented itself, and it was a positive net, you know, result that the majority of those opportunities to be data hungry were not taken. I mean, I think if we want to think about this in terms of how do we further optimize both the needs of public health and the need for data for targeted intervention, and the overwhelming need across everywhere else for privacy, you know, philosophically, both in terms of you know, the nature of you know, privacy in an individual, and security, and all of that for society. Is there a way that we get somewhat more towards giving more data for public health without sacrificing security and privacy? And I really don't have the answer. And I think that's something that, you know, we need to kind of continue to think about, and be okay if the answer is there isn't anything else. You know, I think maybe it's just that you just have to respect the privacy first, but, you know, be very aware of what limitations are provided, or limitations that are, you know, within that answer.
Thanks, Mike. All right, so Tiffany, I want to open up a kind of a one last Pandora's box question before kind of focusing us on like, and then what's next, and then we'll wrap up a little bit before 9 Pacific, because I know we've been keeping all the panelists for a while, and I really appreciate everybody's time and all the questions. So I think there's pretty broad agreement on this panel that the applications that use the decentralized Google Apple model, much better, privacy first, you know, like, so let's focus on those for a second, right? For the topic of this question. There's questions from the audience from a number of folks asking, and it joins with some of the questions I have. The first part of the question is, what if we had just installed these apps by default on everybody's phone, right? Like, what if we just, like, public benefit, push it out there, right? The most extreme version. Allie's raising her eyebrows at me, but that's cool. That's the right thing. So that would have been a public benefit. And one could make the claim that there was no privacy risk. So it's okay, right? That's sort of the extreme version. There's a slightly less extreme version, which, I'm a super geek wannabe epidemiologist on this. So I spent a lot of time reading about the disease and whatnot, and I try not to step out of my lane too much, but I think this is so important. And I've read about how, this disease has this property of over dispersion, which is like, there are times it doesn't spread, and then boom, it has a big a super spreading event, right? And we don't exactly know why, but that seems to be the behavior, which would mean that, what if we enable this sort of tracking by default, so that it's all recorded on people's phones? But if you're infected, then you can turn on the app and then turn on the notification part, but backtrack to 2 weeks, even if you didn't have the app installed before. So there's the extreme version of like, what if we push the app out to everybody by default? And then there's a slightly less extreme version, which is, what if we do the sort of Bluetooth tracking, but it's not accessible to any application, it's not reported to any server at all, that it would allow us to turn it on and then retroactively get the 14 days of tracking data for people who are infected. That is also obviously a lot more forward of an intervention than what we do today. And so from the legal perspective, from the privacy perspective, Tiffany, like, is this just impossible? Is this something we could never consider? What are your thoughts on that? And I know I'm asking a thorny question, but that's why we have you on the panel.
Yeah, interesting. So my first thought was, I guess two things. So definitely the law, which in a moment we'll talk about. But my first thought was, I remember a few years ago when Apple loaded the U2 album onto everyone's iTunes and everyone's phones. So I thought about that. That did not go over that well. So I'm just imagining now this automatic contact tracing app. So it's interesting though, because we sort of did get that preloaded onto our phones, right? But there was an option to, turn it on or turn it off, to join if you wanted to. And I don't think that having the exposure notification tool on your phone was that big a problem for people, because they had the option to opt in or opt out. And I think that's really important. We can see some interesting case examples from abroad. Some countries that did have it, like a mandated digital quarantine app, for example, or a contact tracing app. And there are arguments that may have been more helpful in terms of just making sure, say, people stay home, or making sure we were able to trace outbreaks as they occurred. But there's always the flip side. And I think this is something that obviously everyone in this audience knows about. But every time we allow for a greater incursion on privacy, even for very good reasons, right? For stop the extremism, for example. Sometimes, we can't really roll it back after. So we saw, after 9/11, for example, and after the USA Patriot Act, we saw a lot of changes in the abilities for government to conduct surveillance. And nothing has really been rolled back too much since then, right? So even if we have a really good excuse, there are some privacy risks. That said, when all of this started happening back in March or so, I think it was March or April, I wrote an op-ed with the title, which maybe a couple of you here might appreciate, which was "Give All My Data to Google and the CDC." And my argument there was that if it can help, I absolutely want my data to be entered into whatever contact tracing app, whatever national database there is, right? Like, I think we all wanted to, and we still want to, stop the pandemic as soon as possible. There's just too many harms right now. The issue, though, is I want to be able to participate in these great public health efforts and feel like I'm making, a difference, but I don't want to give up on my privacy. So that's why it was so exciting to see the Google and Apple notification tool, and to see all the very, very fast research on privacy preserving techniques for contact tracing that was done, right at the start, building off of course, 30 years of public health research. That's all been exciting, because I think we do need to have more of this. We will need to utilize data more, and there needs to be some way to make it just more acceptable for people. And it's not just consumer perception, which we've talked about, and trust, but we need the privacy preserving technologies, which many of us have spoken about. And I think many of the people in the audience have worked on the privacy and security techniques to ensure that we can do this. We're going to need it in the future. This is not the last pandemic. As Marcel mentioned, this is not the only public health issue, right? We want to be able to use data. We want to use it for research, for disease surveillance, and more. So we do need protections. And one way to do that potentially is through creating or changing some of our current laws that protect privacy, and making sure that, for example, we are able to tell people that if they join this, if they turn on the exposure notification tool, if their data is collected by this federal database, that the data won't then later be used against them. And making sure they know that their location is not being tracked, right? Because location data is obviously very sensitive. So the education front, the legal front, the technology front, we do really have to have more interdisciplinary work for all of this to work.
If I can add just a quick, oh, sorry, Ben. Yeah, I just had a, it's a really interesting question. I think there are a couple of things we can look to that will help us understand the importance of trust in making this a successful system and a successful approach. So one is the amount of confusion there was when even the Android and iPhone system added the option to turn it on at the device level. There was a sort of rumor going around at that time that we had done, Ben, which you asked, which is just turn it on for everyone. That rumor was not well received. It was also not true, luckily, but I think that does give you a sense of what kind of reaction you might have seen if that had been the decision that was made. And from there, I think the other point that's important for us to consider in this question is it's not just having the app on your phone or not, or just, enabling Bluetooth or not. It's every other decision you make about your phone. So your phone is not, despite how some of us may live our lives, actually glued to your body, right? People can leave it behind, people can turn it off, people can disable settings. And so it's not just a matter of, is the app installed or even is the app running, but is the person making the conditions for the app to be successful. And so there's a huge amount of variability that people do have more flexibility even past the point of, is the app installed and enabled, that you would then sort of have to account for in terms of whether or not that would work. So in addition to the question of how do you make a trusted system, how do you engage with people to make sure they are in control, that they feel that they understand the technology and how it is being used, you really have to consider that there are a lot of conditions that have to be met for this to be absolutely successful. And those are the conditions that the sort of downstream pieces that are harder to have visibility into and harder to correct if they're changed. And so trust was essential, not just for people to participate, but for people to participate faithfully. The other thing I would note that was really interesting and a lesson learned, I think, throughout this process for everybody is the challenges of communicating about how this technology worked. As I mentioned in the panel discussion, or sorry, the kind of opening remarks, it's very challenging to explain something that is relatively novel, that doesn't have a super perfect analogy or a different piece of technology you can compare it to. So there was a lot of trust building that needed to happen, even just on making it clear how the technology worked. And again, a lot of gratitude to our public health partners, to folks who were publishing papers or doing some of those communications and really helping build that understanding. That was a tremendously helpful process. But I think the challenge that we faced there really also indicated that if you had sort of made a sudden movement or taken a more dramatic path, at least in the beginning, it would have been so poorly received that you could have endangered the entire effort.
Yeah, and I think just to add, I think that generally what we're all saying is this issue of the need for prospective consent for usage of information for health-related purposes, essentially. I think everyone, in this audience is generally aware of how much information is gathered on us for things outside of that, using geolocation for simple things like shopping, your manufacturer's advertising identifier on your phone, a number of other things where this data is available. And, there's a lot less security and privacy that is guaranteed by that sort of data collection than what you see with the privacy preserving nature of the Apple and Google exposure notification system or any other non-geolocation based solution. And I think it's also kind of like being aware of that is sort of galvanizing to not use retrospectively collected data for these sorts of health-related purposes. So, geolocation data is available a lot of times for, in ways that you're not aware of, or that you wouldn't have preferred to have been, recorded, I guess, from your device. And that data is available for use retrospectively. And, having, making sure that that's not used for, for COVID, for, other for health-related purposes is sort of another level beyond just, making sure that the prospective consent process is honored in, these, even in pandemic situations like this.
Thank you, Mike. So I do want to point out, regarding the U2 album situation, that I think we can all agree that if it had been the Joshua Tree album or even Achtung Baby, it would have been okay. It's just, which U2 album it was, which was the problem. Anyways, I needed to say that as a moderator. Clearly that's an important point. But jokes aside, you've all been fantastic. I want to open it up for one last future looking question, and you can all jump in. Looking to the future, is this code going to stay on our phones? Are we keeping it there in case of the next pandemic, which we know is inevitable, right? Is this kind of contact tracing usable for other diseases, contact tracing other diseases that we're talking about today? And even more broadly than that, is this kind of collaboration between Google, Apple, the epidemiology world, CDC, is this the kind of bridge that's going to be stable, to use your analogy, Marcel? And this is an amalgamation of questions from a bunch of folks in the audience, not all just me. How do you see the future of this play out?
I can take a run at the very first point. So when Google and Apple announced their partnership back in April, and in our communication since then, we have noted that the intention is to turn off the API technology when the pandemic is addressed. Of course, nobody knows what the conditions of addressing this pandemic look like. And so I think that is the starting point. The promise that was made was that this technology was created to address this situation. And it was created with the promise that it would not necessarily persist in perpetuity. There is additionally the capability to turn it off or to kind of toggle that by region, understanding that some areas may have different kind of states of being around the pandemic at different periods of time. So just sort of in the question, I understand is hypothetical, but that is the statements that have been made from Google and Apple since the beginning. And so just wanted to note those statements for the answer to the question.
I was just gonna, I guess, sort of harken back to the question that I posed sort of at the end of my presentation, which, in my own personal opinion, I think was one of hopefulness in retaining the positive aspects of collaboration, broadly speaking, between the tech sector and public health. And I think that, that's a very, obviously a broad blanket statement about what one would consider as the positive, the positive implications there. But what I really wanted to get across in my presentation was just kind of the novelty and the value of having these two sort of independent communities at the table and talking in a relatively open way, kind of for the first time. And I think that that's a positive precedent to set. I'm not sure exactly where we go from there, but I think that retaining a degree of confidence with a public-private partnership and being able to, at least keep it on the back burner and say, I know that we've made these relationships before when looking towards some of the big thorny problems that a technological solution could augment or provide value to. It's good to have made those contacts, and I think that would be something that could be valuable going forward. Although that's not really any definite or nuanced answer about a particular detail or particular problem yet to solve. But just knowing that those initial relationships have been made, I think makes it a little bit easier to work together in the future.
Yeah, I can echo that. I mean, I very much appreciate what happened here in terms of collaboration. I mean, of course, in principle, I would prefer in the future that you know, that wouldn't even be necessary. I mean, Google and Apple stepped in, and I think given the situation, that was great. And I think it came also to the attention of a lot of people that I sort of was around, that yes, there are two companies that control the operating systems of the phones. It was interesting to see that there was news to some people. So it would also be interesting to sort of think about, you know, where can these collaborations happen, where it doesn't come even to the situation where you actually depend on any given company on making a decision, but you can just use what's already there, right? And what these operating systems already provide. But you know, given that this wasn't the case, I think I am looking back on this development quite very, very positively. And it was sort of, especially since we seem to have such a hard time getting digital off the road, this extremely rapid collaboration between governments, academics, and industry in an extremely short time, with what I can only describe as a all-around pretty positive outcome, to me is also sort of one of the optimistic takeaways, right, from this pandemic. It's like, okay, I mean, if push comes to shove, we can actually get our act together and build good things, and that to me, you know, makes me optimistic. I still want to turn this thing off, and that's also in the sense that it's great that we can just all turn this off on our own, and we don't need to ask anybody's permission. That was also an important part of the concept, of course, from day one.
Tiffany, any last words on your end?
Definitely, you know, more collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration, public-private partnerships, but also I think, you know, more privacy protections generally, which is a matter of both our technology, right, developing more, you know, PETs and so on, but also our social norms, you know, education, awareness campaigns, and then also law. There are two bills in Congress right now about coronavirus and privacy. I don't know if either will go anywhere, uncertain. And we do have privacy laws that exist that protect sensitive health data. And we can work to make these a little better, to you know, adapt to the realities of this pandemic and potentially the next one. So there are things we can do, and we can make this work. We don't want to get into the, you know, what if phones but too little time. So I think, you know, let's all work together to make the tech work for all of us.
I want to thank all four of you again. Thank you so much for this extended Q&A, which was awesome. And I hope the audience, I hope I did you proud with relaying the questions. If there are other questions in Slack and the panelists have time, please do jump in and if you can, if you're willing to answer them or post links to follow up reading materials. Folks in Slack, do check. There have been a bunch of answers already from panelists in the Slack session. Thank you again, everybody. I believe there's a break now, and I'm so happy we could do this.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks,
Thank
Ben.
you. Thanks all.